Hello and welcome one and all to Cocktails and Spirits and ADHD. Thank you so much for coming. We hope in this session to explore neurodiversity behind the bar, to celebrate it, to break down stigma surrounding neurodivergence. And as we go, we plan to build a toolkit for anyone who leads a neurodiverse team, but also for those of you who might have ADHD and are looking for ways to better manage it in the workplace. I'm joined by three fabulous panelists, so let me introduce them to you. We are joined all the way from Hong Kong by Tom Egerton, who is the spirits evangelist for Proof & Co. We have got Dr Nancy Doyle, who is one of the world's leading experts on neurodiversity in the workplace, and also the founder for Genius Within. And we also have Chanel Adams, who is the Operations Director of Carbon and also the beverage consultant for Kanda and Yem, also from Hong Kong. Finally, let me introduce myself. My name is Hannah Lanfear, and I am the founder of the Mixing Class. We are very proudly the sponsors of this seminar. And the Mixing Class is a company that deals predominantly in spirits education, WSET spirits courses that we deliver mainly to the cocktail and spirits trade. I've spent a good 21 years in the cocktail and spirits industry as a bartender, bar manager, and so on. But I spend most of my time talking about booze these days. So let's start then. I would just like to explore quickly what ADHD is. I think that's a good place to start. And these letters stand for Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder, and it can come in hyperactive or inattentive forms. Essentially, it is a neurological difference that affects the prefrontal cortex, which is a part of your brain responsible for organization, self-control, and also maintaining attention. Now, I suspect that many of you tuning in might perhaps be neurodivergent in some way, or perhaps someone you know and love is. Perhaps it sounds familiar. But how does this manifest for folk then? Well, to be ADHD is sometimes like being a round peg that has been forced to fit into a square hole. And I say that because the education system is really built for neurotypical young people. If you have ADHD, the classroom setting and the rigor and regimen of the classroom setting doesn't necessarily suit you. And it's completely false that ADHDers don't love learning. They do, but we don't like the style of learning that's given to us when we are younger. And this can result in perhaps dropping out of school, dropping out of college. And I'd like to share my story of how that happened to me, and ultimately I ended up in the cocktail industry because I was asked to leave college. I dropped out of nursing school, and I'd always been working in pubs when I was a young person. So at 18 years old, I moved to London and I started making drinks, and I loved it. I think there's something really to be celebrated about how our industry offers such a fantastic vocation for people who are neurodivergent in some way. It's fast-paced, it's really social, it's super fun, and ultimately we get constant hits of dopamine as we're making cocktails, giving them to guests, and then seeing the joy. And that's very rewarding to have so much passion for your work. I fell in love with learning about cocktails, learning about spirits. And I think, again, our industry offers such a mine of learning. And as I mentioned, we might not really like the regimen of school, and I cannot learn something unless I am interested in it. Nonetheless, learning about cocktails and spirits was really exciting to me. And I suppose I want to celebrate that. As a business owner, neurodivergent people can often end up founding their own businesses. We are creative, we're innovative, we think on our feet. And for me, sharing my love and enthusiasm and passion for learning has become a career that spanned 2 decades and taking me all over the world. So let me return to my slides for just a moment. I would like to introduce each one of our panelists. So Chanel, could you please say hello for us? Hiya.
My name is Chanel Adams. I'm originally from Washington, D.C., and I'm now living in Hong Kong for the past 5 years. I'm the operations director for a new venue called Carbon, and I'm also the beverage consultant for a cafe called Yem and a new hip-hop lounge opening next month called Candor. I have been bartending for 6.5 years, I would say. I began in founding Farmers Tyson's as part of the opening team, and then I went to Bar Mini by Jose Andres for about 2 years before moving to Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, I opened Happy Paradise with a famous chef named Mei Chow, and then I opened Please Don't Tell in the landmark Mandarin Oriental. After which I became the commercial director for a company called Merchants of Pleasure. They focus on importing La Maison de Whiskey products as well as premium agave spirits. I began my medication journey for ADHD when I was 18 years old, and I was medicated until I was about 24 years old. I felt like I stopped my medication because I felt like there had to be a better way, a more sustainable way for me to essentially handle the symptoms of having ADHD in my regular life. And so I began my journey of figuring out different tools and tricks that I might be able to use to essentially balance my life out a little bit. Those tools I'll share later in this.
Tom, would you say hello for us, please?
Hello, thank you. As was said, my name is Tom. So I'm originally from New Zealand, but I live in Hong Kong, where I've been for the last 4 years. And I work for Proof & Company as a spirits evangelist. So a spirits evangelist is essentially a creative development position. So we work with hotels, brands, bartenders, to sort of bring to life various projects, whether it's sort of large-scale cocktail projects, cocktail venue projects. So Atlas in Singapore, Argo recently opened here in Hong Kong, and a slew of others across Asia Pacific. I have been in hospitality for most of my life. I started at 13 years old as a pot wash and went through every different department: front of house, back of house, kitchen, bar management, all styles of venues, hotels, small bars, owner-operated, and chains. And 2 years ago, I moved from daily service and daily operations to the job as spirits evangelist, which spends a lot more time in offices. And it was at that time of transition, which I found particularly hard, I started to think about the potential for diagnosis. And I went to see a mental health professional who told me that I had both ADHD and sort of a low-lying depressive qualities, which was feeding into that. So fully diagnosed, and here I am today to talk about it.
Dr. Nancy, I'd love to hear a little bit about you as well, because I know that you also have ADHD. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I'm just noticing how entrepreneurial we all are. Did you know that ADHDers are twice as likely to start a business when they graduate compared to neurotypicals?
Amazing.
Yeah.
But then that also is, that path is also sometimes fraught with difficulty. Speaking from the experience of looking at my end of year accounts and being like, fuck.
Oh, lady, tell me. So my Genius Within is my company. Genius Within is a social enterprise that supports all neurovariants under the neuro minority umbrella, all forms of neurodivergence, neurodiverseness, neuroqueer, whatever word you feel that you want to associate with is all welcome to me. Yeah, so our job is neurodiversity at work. It's making sure that the neurodiversity community are able to achieve their potential in their life, in their work life, should that be where they choose to focus their energies. And so Genius Within was an extension of my own consultancy. So I've worked in this field for 25 years. In one form or another. Before it was cool, can I just say that? So way before it was cool, I was doing this. Can I have an award? Thank you very much. And so now it's cool. So that's all very interesting to me. I'm like, you know, the doors that I used to kick outside, like, oh, come in, do tell us about this very exciting thing. Yeah, so I worked as a consultant. I used to do diagnostics. I became a psychologist because I was angry with psychologists because I'd never met one that I liked. They were all absolute muppets. And then when I started working with mentally ill children, I also thought they were all muppets and they wouldn't pay any attention to me. So I thought, right, I will become a psychologist and then you will have to listen to what I have to say. And my 15-year-old son summed this up for me the other day when we were talking about his career. He said, "Mum, can I just check, is your entire career based on a grudge?" I was like, yes, it is. But it is working. So I set out to tell psychologists they were wrong, and I now sit on all the committees at the BPS, and I'm trying to change the way that we diagnose, the way that we label, the way that we involve communities of lived experience in decisions about research and practice, etc. And I am but one woman, and I am not going to make it all better, but I am giving it a damn good go. So I worked as an independent consultant for myself from the age of 23. I like to think I'm unmanageable. One thing I'm very proud of. And when my kids started school, I found it really hard to do consulting because you have to go away for like 2 or 3 days at a time, and grandmas don't mind that, but grandmas do not like coming to look after kids when you have to be the person that gets them to school every day and get them to tie up their shoelaces and brush their teeth. They don't like that. They like, shall we go to the park and eat ice creams all day? They do not like, have you done your homework? So I figured that if I started subcontracting the 3 or 4 day work and started just doing the kind of nearby work, that I could just about make ends meet with my husband's job as well. And that first year I had 7 associates, the second year 25, the third year 52, the fourth year 74. Genius Within is just celebrating its 10th anniversary. We have 150 associates across the world and 50 full-time staff in the UK. So
that's amazing.
Yeah. My side hustle while my kids were at school turned into a thing. And we support neurodivergent adults who are in prison. We work in 3 prisons in the UK. We work with long-term unemployed people in the UK, and we work with several large international corporates across the world, doing workplace consulting, HR consulting, hiring projects, things like that. And in the middle of all this, of course, I had to be diagnosed, didn't I? Because I wasn't diagnosed as a teenager because I'm the wrong age. Teenage girls didn't get diagnosed. Generation X teenage girls did not get diagnosed with ADHD. It wasn't an available condition for us. We were anxious, we were eating disordered, we had school phobia, where some of us had oppositional defiant disorder. Depends on the colour of our skin as well. Some of us were just bad. So it depends how racist people were around us. Those things were really important. But then when I was in my late 30s, the rules on diagnosing ADHD in girls changed because they realised that they had missed all the girls, because our experience is different and our gender typing means that we are not generally throwing chairs across rooms at teachers at the age of 5, 6 and 7. And so if you weren't doing that in the 80s, 90s and early 2000s, you weren't getting an ADHD diagnosis, basically. So they changed the rules on how you could diagnose girls. And I went, there we go, that's it. That's what I was waiting for. Thank you very much. And so I got my diagnosis, and I found it really vindicating, actually. Vindicating and cathartic is what I would say. And I've, having diagnosed lots and lots of people, hundreds of people myself, I feel like it's quite a straightforward process that you go through as a late diagnosee, which is that initially you go, there, yeah, see, I knew there was something. I knew I wasn't, I knew that there was something. I knew it wasn't working. And then you kind of go, oh God, I wish I'd known about this 20 years ago. I would have been this, I would have done that. I would have had this opportunity. Now it's too late, and you just kind of, and then you have to kind of make your peace with it. So yeah, it's an interesting journey, isn't it? The late diagnosis. Is that what you wanted to know? I've lost the plot. I've gone off on a thread. What happened?
It resonates very much with me. I think there's also a little bit of, although anger isn't an emotion that I want to lean into today, you look back at your life, and I remember going to my mum and saying, you know about this, right? I've got a diagnosis now, and she was like, well, I've always known that, obviously.
I've had such an interesting
doing nothing about it. Nothing.
Yeah, so I was always being told off by my parents. I was the family scapegoat. Nancy's naughtiness was the problem with everything. Let's not pay attention to the state of my parents' marriage, which was diabolical. Oh no, it's nothing to do with that. It's Nancy being naughty. And it's, weirdly, it's like in the last 5 years, I've suddenly realised how appallingly ADHD my mum is. I mean, my mum is like literally the most ADHD person I've ever met. She speaks 5 languages. She learned Spanish, French and German right through to 18, and was fluent. And then she taught herself Italian and Portuguese because she was interested. But by the same token, she has never been on time for anything in her life. Like never, ever on time. And she has a summer watch and a winter watch. And sometimes she's late because she's got the wrong one on. And it's, it's absolute chaos. And I kind of went, oh, there's no point in me being grumpy with her, because literally she had and then you find out about your grandparents, don't you? And my Auntie Dillis dropped something and she said, well, of course, Uncle Bernard had to teach me to tell the time because there were no clocks in my house growing up. Like, what? There were no clocks in your house? How does that even happen? And then you just go through it all and you go, yeah.
So hereditary then, isn't it? That's what we're looking at. Well, I tell you what, we must crack on because we've got so much to share and lots of really enthralling information, and we will run out of time. So let's have you, Dr. Nancy, if you please, explain a little bit to someone who might not be aware of all of this jargon that we're talking about, what neurodivergence is, please.
Yeah, okay. So the idea of neurodiversity is broadly that there is diversity in the way our neurological profiles are formed. So, it's perfectly normal and natural for humans to have neurological diversity, to have strengths and weaknesses, to have things that we're good at, not so good at. And the majority of people fall into this group of what we call neurotypicals, which is where most of their strengths and weaknesses are much of a muchness. So they're as good at verbal skills as they are at visual skills, as they are at processing speed, as they are at working memory. It's all about average. It might be a little bit better here and a little bit better there and a little bit worse there, but it's much for muchness. And then you've got these other group of people where there's these big disparities between the things that we're good at and the things that we're not good at. Like the fact that my mum can pick up a language like that, she could not be on time if her life depended on it. So that's a perfect example of a really spiky profile of outstanding strengths and difficulties, and all so there's lots of words flying around. So you might want to say that I am a neurodiverse person. Other people say you can't say that because neurodiversity is a property of the species, not the individual. Rah, rah, rah. There's lots of debates about it. So the word neurodivergence, neurodiverse, or neurominority simply means not neurotypical, basically. And so within that category, who is not neurotypical is as there's no police, there's no official law of neurodiversity that decides who's in and who's out. There's no one gatekeeping that. But the conditions that are typically associated with being a neurominority or a neurovariant or a neuro-unusual, literally it's up to you how you choose to identify, are autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. That's kind of like the main ones that tend to get associated with the category, but also more and more Tourette's syndrome. So 65% of people with Tourette's have ADHD as well. There's a huge overlap between Tourette's and ADHD. But you could also say that mental health needs such as anxiety, depression, and things acquired neurodiversity is when you get a long-term health condition that creates that spiky profile for you. So it might be something like multiple sclerosis or chronic fatigue syndrome or Parkinson's, where your one area of your brain is functioning brilliantly and the other one starts to kind of deplete. Could even be an acquired brain injury. And then the thing about those two is they're not developmental, so you're not born with those, but they are quite kind of natural. Like we have these things. It's normal for people to be anxious and depressed. It's normal for there to be conditions that affect our thinking that we acquire as we age. And so when you're thinking about neurodiversity as a natural property of the species, it stands to reason that you would also start to include these things, because when 16% of the population are experiencing a mental health need, we've got to kind of admit that that's actually quite normal. And so is it normal for people to be anxious and depressed? And the whole thing of the neurodiversity movement is to avoid the pathologization. So rather than say, so we've got 1% of the population autistic, 5 to 6% of the population ADHD and dyspraxic, 10% dyslexic, 16% with a mental health need. what's the purpose of this? Why do we keep having people like this? If it was all negative, we would have bred it out of the gene pool by now, and we haven't. So we've consistently got these minorities who are kind of specialist thinkers in different things. So dyslexics tend to be specialist visual thinkers or storytellers. Dyspraxics tend to be special thinkers in terms of verbal skills. My mum is also dyspraxic. Autists tend to be really good at fine detail processing and concentration. ADHDers have creativity, hyperfocus, energy. So given that we've got all these specialists, there's something actually really normal about having a community of humans where most people are generalists and then a few of us are specialists. And actually that just seems like a really lovely, well-balanced team. So the whole idea of neurodivergence and neurodiversity is to find neutral language to describe normal variations in the human neurological cognitive profile, in a nutshell.
What a lovely nutshell. Well, I've not finished my questions for you, Dr. Nancy, because I'd also like to know a little bit more about ADHD and how it affects the brain, because I think we think of it as a set of traits, but there's a significant reason for these traits, isn't there?
I know. Well, the thing is about autism and ADHD is that they're both diagnosed at the moment with behavioural checklists that are really subject to social biases about how people should and shouldn't behave. So it's really difficult. So what's going on at the moment is lots of research to try and understand what's actually happening neurologically that we could say is a definitive characteristic. And interestingly, there are very few differences between autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia that you can see on neuroimaging. So neuroimaging studies continually cannot find those diagnostic boundaries. They don't exist. So that's an interesting thing right there. So but what does seem to be different, particularly for ADHD, is around neurotransmitters, and in particular dopamine and norepinephrine or noradrenaline, depending on which country you're in, the same thing. So I'm going to talk to you about dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and its purpose in our brain is to let us know when we've had enough. So when you've had enough dopamine, you feel satisfied and you stop. So if you are eating, it lets you know you've had enough. Oh, I've enjoyed a chocolate bar, I shall stop eating chocolate now. It lets you know you've had enough affection. It lets you know you've had enough exercise. It lets you know when to stop, and it makes you feel really satisfied and complete. And ADHDers have less dopamine than the general population. And I don't like to say it's a dopamine deficit. I just like to say that we have less dopamine than the general population, because again, if you think about our evolutionary background, let's imagine there's 150 humans living in a tribe, and 5% of them don't have very much dopamine. And so 5% of them aren't easily satiated. So what do those 5% of the tribe do? They go, oh, I wonder what's over the next hill. I wonder what's over the next hill. Should we go and have a look over there? I bet you there's some really nice fruit trees over there. Should we go and see, shall we? So actually, it's not necessarily a bad thing, not being satisfied. It makes you curious. It's where that creativity comes from. It's because we're constantly looking for enough stimulation to make us feel satisfied. And so the benefit of that is all of the creativity, all of the adventurousness, all of the curiosity that takes us over that next hill and over that next hill and over that next hill. And so I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And if you are in the wrong context, like a modern education system where you're supposed to sit still all the day and write things down on a piece of paper or type things into a machine, then it can be quite difficult to feel enough dopamine to feel satisfied. But if you're working in the cocktail industry and you've got a nice busy bar with lots of interesting people, and your job is to maybe think of some interesting mixes that no one's ever thought of before, or then actually that need to feel satisfied and to keep going makes you super productive, super curious, super interested to talk to people, super functional. So I think it's potentially a benefit. And we do know that ADHD is more common in the armed services, in the emergency services, because again, you've got that constant need to be alert and to be looking for the next thing. And then that combines with noradrenaline / epinephrine, which is kind of part of the adrenaline epinephrine system, and it's about how it's basically your fight-flight response. So again, we've got a lower baseline of that. So we require more danger to go into fight, flight, freeze. So we won't go into fight, flight, freeze at the same level as other people. We'll get there later. But the flip side of that, it's really quite annoying actually. So there's like 3 levels for noradrenaline. There's the low level where you're so under risked that you're basically comatose. And then there's the mid-range where everything's firing and your prefrontal cortex is on its A game. And then there's the point where you've maxed out and you've gone into like rabbit in headlights mode and you can't handle it anymore. So because we've got less, we actually sit in that kind of can't be bothered band for too long. So we need a certain amount of risk to get us out of bed in the morning. Risk / entertainment / interest / busyness, you know. But also it means that we will stay functional in a crisis way beyond what other people will do. So basically ADHDers are your warriors, we are your defenders of the tribe, we are the ones who are awake late listening for bears or approaching invaders, we are the ones who will find the cache of fruit trees and the next herd of antelope to go and chase. And we are the ones who will get you there and think of all the ideas of how we're going to make that happen. And that is a benefit to humankind.
I think that's just about the best description I've ever heard of ADHD. I'm taking that with me for the future.
Good.
Let's talk ADHD and intersectionality. I feel like, well, I don't feel like, in fact, studies show that there are significant overlaps with ADHD and other important issues, and I wondered if you could talk us through some of these. Now, the statistic here is up for discussion, perhaps, and you know, research can often be a little bit finger in the air and pulling numbers out of a hat, but there is certainly a crossover between queerness, gender queerness, and trans person, gender diverse persons, and also sexuality. And I wondered if you could talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that research is just starting to come out more and more, actually. And that's why I was asking you about where you got that number from earlier, because it's like, oh, I could do with that reference. I'm looking for it all the time. But there's no real neurological reason as to why that should be the case. Do you know what I mean? There's no kind of like, okay, so part of being ADHD equals the parts of the brain that deal with gender. So there's no kind of like, it would have to be true. So I think that, but what my take on it is that there is an authenticity and a natural predisposition towards breaking the rules if you don't fit in, that allows you to be more open and honest about other things that are true in your life. Do you know? But one of the cautions that I have there about the intersectionality there is that you get this kind of what's called diagnostic shadowing. So one of the things we've found in the trans community, for example, is that autism is ignored. So autism and ADHD are not treated, supported, attended to, because the most pressing thing is the trans and the treatment for trans. So you've got lots of trans people who have got significant untreated autism and ADHD because they're not getting looked at for that. But you've also got some weird stuff going on with the hormones. So sex hormones do have odd impacts on Tourette's, ADHD and autism. So testosterone is particularly difficult for autists. Estrogen appears to have a protective effect, but only at certain points in the cycle. Other points in the cycle, it's annoying. And when women are in the PMS phase, they have more tics. If they have Tourette's, tics are harder to control in PMS phase. So there are some odd things going on with hormones and neurodivergence that we just don't know enough about yet. What I can say is there's nothing obvious that says this must go with this. But what there is are these kind of, hormonal impacts on what we experience as symptoms, and these social context in which, if you're prepared to put yourself out there about one set of rules and say, no, I'm not neurotypical, or I'm not heterosexual or straight or cis, then you're also more likely to be able to come out in other ways.
That's so interesting, and it makes a lot of sense, actually. I feel like we'll leap back onto that comment in a couple, but let's also talk about ethnicity and the stigma of ADHD and how different communities receive support, but also might view neurodiversity.
I mean, historically, for Black Indigenous people of colour growing up in kind of, you know, white cultures like the USA, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and most of Western Europe, you've got kind of institutionalized racism that will have pathologized behavior as naughty versus distressed. And so you've got that label that was more quickly wielded for people of color. I mean, I actually gave a presentation recently called Neurodiversity is Sexist, Racist and Ableist, Discuss. And it was, you know, so, you know, we've got some big issues with the representation of the neurodiversity movement. And the reason we've got those issues is because we haven't got the diagnoses. And but that's starting to change, I have to say. There's some really good, if you use the hashtag autistic while Black and ADHD while Black, you'll get, people are starting to come out in the community voices, and professionals are starting to change that. So Black children were actually diagnosed with autism at a higher rate than white children last year in the UK for the first time ever. That doesn't mean there were more, it just means that we're starting to redress that balance, and it will kind of do this for a little while. But the other thing that you've got going on there is cultural norms between nationalities. They're not necessarily about race or ethnicity, but actually national policies, national cultures. So, for example, ADHD doesn't exist if you're French. So as far as French people are concerned, it's naughty children and bad parenting, end of. And there's, you know, there are different rates of diagnosis between the USA and Europe. And that's partially to do with culture and national policies, but it's also partially to do with genetics, I think, genuinely. So what my critiques of that are things like, well, you know, so basically the USA is entirely populated by people who have either survived genocide / slavery, or the people who were really fed up 300 years ago and decided to get on a boat going somewhere they'd never been before, where they may or may not have survived the journey, and they didn't know what to expect when they got there, and they didn't have any money. So if that's your gene pool, are you or are you not going to have more ADHDers than the people in Ireland who are descended from the people who were sat around 200 years going, well, there's not very many potatoes, but I think if we just wait for a few more years, it'll be all right.
Such a good point.
So, you know, there's so much going on there, but the most important thing in terms of intersectionality is the intersectional message, which is that a black ADHDer is experiencing ADHD differently to a white ADHDer. And I often say in my journey, I didn't get diagnosed until adulthood, but at least I wasn't expelled and I wasn't in prison, which I think is possibly what would have happened to me if I'd had different coloured skin. So there's that aspect of intersectionality is really important for us to remember when we are approaching this topic at work, is that it's the addedness of the different protected characteristics that are at play.
So I feel like I would have put these in a different order, because I feel like these last two comments of ADHD symptoms worsened by trauma and poverty and incarceration are also then intertwined with ethnicity.
They are, but they're all. I mean, they are, but they also do stand on their own. You know, I mean, it's that. But you know, isn't that the topic of conversation in so many political sectors right now? You know, what is the privilege quota of, you know, and so there's kind of individual experience, but it's about the layers, isn't it? It is about those layers, and I mentioned about premenstrual magnification earlier, the perfect storm, and you know, gender is an issue here as well. So I think for me, the reason I wasn't diagnosed is because I was female, and so that's a negative. But equally, the reason I'm not in jail is because I'm, if you kind of have my level of ADHD and you put it in a different kind of identity, what would my experience be? And those things are super, super relevant. And yeah, neither of my parents were a bit bonkers, as I might have noted, and they didn't always like each other, but neither of them was in jail, neither of them was drunk, we had a roof over our head. Those things matter. They matter a lot in terms of the scaffolding and my ability to somehow make it through the school system with qualifications, even though I had a 20% attendance record. Very proud of that.
You and me could go bowling on that attendance record.
Let's do it. I was once interviewed by some guy who was writing a book about post-traumatic growth, and he kept wanting me to tell him what the school could have done to keep me in it, and I was like, not been a school. He was trying to draw it out. Yes, but if they'd done this, if they'd done this, if they'd done no, I just didn't want to go there. Anyway,
let's talk about how ADHD and everything that we've discussed can intertwine with our industry and our business. And I feel like we'll pull Tom and Chanel back into the conversation here. Now, I know full well that this sounds like a lot of negative attributes, but the goal of this is to look at where challenges lie and then to resolve them, talking about positive ways that we can overcome them. But these are some of the things that our unique brain chemistry might offer us, and difficulty with getting and staying organised. I can say from personal experience that I book flights for the wrong day, I've booked hotels for the wrong day, the wrong year, sometimes wrong month, double booked meetings, not showed up. Things like managing emotion can be quite tough in an environment that's fast paced and can often have critical feedback, following directions. I'm hearing an echo around the room of how we've pushed back a little bit against authority, shifting focus from one thing to another, getting sucked into one thing that you're so fascinated by that actually you get quite irritated, I can say, if someone even tries to pull me out of it. Keeping things in mind, working memory, can't even begin to count the number of times that I've gone home and thought to myself, oh, I never did get that person that glass of water that they asked for 5 different times. Thinking before saying or doing things, getting started on tasks, focusing on what's important and managing time. I want to throw this open to Tom and Chanel and see if any of this resonates with you, with your professional careers perhaps. Tom? Any of these that you were like, oh God, that really is me?
I mean, all of it, really. I mean, yeah, obviously, like, we'll speak more about this later, but just the difference between working in service and then having a sort of a desk job as having professional milestones and sort of things you have to meet and timings. I think the biggest one for me is getting started on tasks. I'm terrible at putting things off and getting distracted. That's definitely the sort of number one thing. And then shifting focus as well is always a huge roadblock to a certain extent, especially just a combination of that and not being able to get started definitely is something that impacts me a lot. Chanel,
what do you reckon?
I think the last point is the one that resonated with me the most, getting started, essentially. I think I've managed to figure out how to focus, how to schedule myself, etc. But getting started on something that I don't want to do is essentially pure will, and that part is quite hard, I would say.
Of course, I'm on mute. Okay, well, in that case, let's continue. I'd like to move into discussing strengths and weaknesses and bring it back to Dr. Nancy Doyle. I can't call you by just your name, by the way. You're only ever going to be Dr. Nancy Doyle, writer for Forbes magazine in my mind. So, what's your full name?
Why I did the PhD.
Yes,
it's just for that moment. Okay, so thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of ADHD, you know, it's a balanced picture. So this is one of my lovely Venn diagrams that I've got lots of. So you've got that ability to hyper focus, and the flip side of alertness is easily distracted. So, you know, but it's the same brain, it's the context that defines whether or not you are easily distracted or alert. You know, those things are both true. Taking on too much and passion and enthusiasm, same thing, exactly the same thing. So lacking attention to detail and problem solving abilities, same thing. Sometimes you are kind of, you know, looking at the bigger picture, and that's what allows you to solve the problem, because you've got the whole thing in mind rather than the finicky detaily bits that no one cares about. Difficulty with people, rubbish. Difficulty with the wrong people. They can all go away, the ones that we have difficulty with. In fact, just hanging out with you guys reminds me of all the fun I had when I worked in the hospitality industry, and my sister. And I'm actually sitting here in my mind going, why am I not just selling my business and opening a bar? Anyway.
We can make that happen for you. You're talking to the right people.
I know I am. You need to speak to my sister. My sister did hospitality for way longer than I did. And the only reason she's not doing it now is because she's full-time mumming to a non-verbal autistic daughter, and she needs to hang out with you guys. So yeah, so these strong 3D visual skills. I mean, I don't know what to say about this really. I just think it's all about the context. You can be in the perfect context where you get all of these things in the right place, or you can be in the wrong team with the wrong kind of company, and then it's like all of your weaknesses. Somebody said to me once that their experience of ADHD was like having a Ferrari engine in a 30-year-old jalopy. You know, so on one day they're like zooming down the motorway, the freeway, and they can just kind of, you know, nail it. And then on other days they turn the corner and all the doors fall off. And I think part of the ADHD journey is learning to predict when that's going to be for you, so that you can kind of accommodate it. And part of the job of a good organization is working on that with you and helping you work that out. And when you've got a doors have all fallen off day, kind of, you know, there's got to be some room to fail occasionally, and to allow yourself to kind of get it wrong and then go, right, that went wrong. How do we prevent that from happening next time? So yeah, all of these are true, and they can all be true on the same day. I can talk too much and have difficulty with people, and I can be really passionate and enthusiastic, and I'm doing it right now.
Well, this is a lovely segue, because it's going to take us in a direction, I think. And it's not all doom and gloom. I think we've talked about the difficulties that you might have if you have ADHD in the workplace, but we bring an awful lot of benefits. And I've said bartending is almost like a natural home for us, because we are by nature perceptive, we can think creatively, we are innovative, we can hyper focus. We are emotive and deeply compassionate by nature, responsive, vigilant, alert, qualities that on a busy Saturday night shift when you are in the weeds and the whole operation is going south, we can pull us back. We have a strong sense of fairness, have social intelligence, and are good conversationalists, spontaneous, funny, and generous. Any of that ring true for you lot? Nodding, shaking? Yeah, I feel like this resonates with me. Obviously, I've pulled it off the internet. Let's talk more then about the cocktail industry. I think it's an amazing vocation with those with ADHD. We have immediate deadlines. Tom, talk us through this, because this is your point.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's definitely something that sort of came to realise, and the working in kitchens and bars, and this very immediate sort of dopamine sort of positive reaction and reinforcing is something that, you know, when I look at past behaviours I saw. So, you know, you're in the kitchen and you're in the bar, it's, you know, ticket comes up, make the drink, make the food, serve the food, person drinks the drink. I like that. Ding, okay, cool. That's a sort of immediate reward, and then you get this, like, you know, tick of dopamine, and that just sort of continues and continues and continues. And we talk a lot about, that sort of rush you get when bartending, and I think that's definitely something that plays into it. And a theory I've long had, which I realise now that I've got an actual professional sitting here, will probably be picked apart. But it's definitely why you see a lot of people fall into addictive patterns of behaviour in hospitality, because people are so used to just like risk reward, risk reward, risk reward. I remember when I first left, frontline hospitality and was sitting behind a desk. I'm sitting down, and my projects now take 8 to 12 months or 16 months. That dopamine comes so much slower, and there was definitely just the time of sitting around and wondering, what on earth am I doing and why am I feeling so down? Is because you get so used to that, like Pavlov dog reaction. You hear the bell and you want the treat, but so that's it's great for people who have the neurodivergency, but it also can feed into other behaviours, which I believe can be harmful.
Well, we'll come back to that. We've got the flip side coming. Let's talk about other things. And I feel like this resonates very much with me. There are so many fascinating subjects to hyper-focus on, be it learning cocktail specs and cocktail histories, and then finding out all the stories behind them, then spirits production and this, that, and the other. And I think we have this incredible industry that gives us lifelong learning, but it's not in a school and it's not regimented, and we don't have that that measure of it that we so often fall out of school or don't enjoy education institutions, but do nonetheless enjoy and love learning, and that's important, I think.
Just
yes,
to interrupt. I think it's kind of funny just looking at hyper focus and behaviour in bartenders. I'm sure people in the bar industry are familiar now with the t-shirt, introverted but willing to discuss Mai Tai specs. Like, that's exactly like this sort of behaviour. It's like, I'm introverted, but I'm willing to hyper focus and argue about 5 mils here and there and what type of rum and orgeat and all this.
So true. So true. It's social, it's people pleasing. I feel like we all of that naughty behaviour that I got told off for in school is essentially just wanting to rub shoulders and have fun, and that's what our industry offers in spades. We get paid to do it, and then to be surrounded by like-minded people. Chanel, these last two I'm handing over to you.
Yeah, so I think for me, the moment that clicked with bartending was in service bar, actually. There's a moment where you have so many tickets coming and you don't even have to think. You just go into this like autopilot mode of making drinks. And then going into the point well, for example, you're just facing people. So many people are talking to you at the same time. And again, you're almost like a machine just making drinks and being able to essentially please them over and over and over again. And it almost feels like a dance. And for me, it felt like the first moment where everything clicked, where everything that I'm naturally good at, I could essentially just become a machine and focus and do everything. That coupled with the social aspect of it. I think the bar community was the first community, just F&B in general, was the first community where I met so many people who are so similar to me, constantly interested in people in general, constantly interested in culture, wanting to explore different food. Basically just, they were always essentially bored and just wanting more and more and more. And I finally felt like I found a sense of community. And on top of that, people tend to help each other a lot more within this community. They tend to be more they tend to try to help motivate each other and really anything that you need. So I felt like I finally found my home, both within a bar and within the community itself.
Lovely. Well, I tell you what, that leads me on to our next slide. And while the cocktail community provides us a wonderful vocation, it can also be a very challenging place to work, and it would be remiss of us not to talk about why. So let's explore these points together. This point's come up a couple of times already, I think, but the challenge of when you move up from bartending and being promoted into being a bar manager wasn't actually an enjoyable time for me. Suddenly I was in charge of the stock, and I had to do stock take, and I had to make it balanced, and I had to tell people off instead of joke with them. Nobody liked me anymore, and I wasn't getting that social buzz. I was just having a miserable time. we don't always give people enough resources to move into those roles, and that's, you know, part and parcel of what I hope we can discuss in the toolkits later. Brisk critical feedback can be somewhat emotionally jarring for ADHDers, and we've mentioned how this is a really fast-paced industry where sometimes we holler something really quite offensive at someone in the spur of the moment. And from my own experiences, I think you can start to spiral downwards if you start to get into a negative mental headspace, and that can be troublesome too. We'll look at maybe how we could adjust our communication to people that we know to have ADHD, perhaps. Working around addictive substances, in the presence of Dr. Nancy, I will defer to you, but I believe us to have perhaps lower impulse control and often can get into a cycle of things like drinking too much too fast, saying yes to party drugs because we want to have fun, things like this. It can be a real issue in our industry.
It's self-medicating. You know, what you're calling low impulse control and is, you know, the thing I described earlier about your adrenaline systems, your epinephrine systems and your dopamine systems. So we are more susceptible to that stuff. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Interestingly, people who are medicated for ADHD have much lower rates of illegal drug use.
Oh, that's very interesting. I did not know. I'm sticking that fact in my back pocket for later. There are other challenges, I think, that maybe are perhaps little things, but we often ask bartenders as they progress through their career to enter cocktail competitions and present. And the idea of making drinks and talking at the same time can be a little bit more challenging for us. Certainly speaking from a dyspraxic point of view as well, I definitely need to focus on my physical things before I start talking at the same time. And public speaking can also be quite terrifying. Is that a medical fact, Dr. Nancy Doyle?
Which one? Sorry, the public speaking?
Things about public speaking. I feel like we can be emotionally a little bit more sensitive perhaps, and therefore not always want to put ourselves out there when it comes to things like public speaking.
I think that's personal. I don't think that's true for all ADHDers. I love public speaking and I always have. Yeah, I was going to be an actress. That was my plan.
No, the fight-flight thing for me, I'm like, get me off this stage.
No, I mean, look, lots of ADHDers. So I have the thing where the more nervous I am, the more I talk. Yes. So I always come across as confident, and people always think I'm confident and self-assured. I see Tom nod there. It doesn't mean I'm so yeah. Lack of confidence doesn't shut me up. So if you have that type of thing, then it's not necessarily an issue. But you know, again, it's that's more about your life experience as a result of having ADHD, your particular profile, the level of privilege, support, scaffolding, positive experiences you've had around public speaking, rather than the ADHD itself.
So let's talk about this one then, burnout, whether physical or emotional. I feel like this is the demon that catches up with you every once in a while, where you just don't want to get out of bed or go to work or talk to anyone, in fact, or do anything. I'm going to come back to you, please, Dr. Nancy, to talk a bit more about that, because I feel like it's rife in our community, is working a bit hard and then that depletion.
The flip side of all that energy and passion, isn't it? You know, you can't go at 150 miles an hour forever. So, you know, what I find is that ADHDers we have to pace ourselves, and we have to build in downtime, and we have to know it's coming. And one of the things that I've learned to do is to have those duvet days and just embrace them and just go into it, rather than running on empty or over medicating to get myself through what my body is actually telling me to do, which is stop. And you know, sometimes you can't, and so sometimes those crutches are there, but yeah, so I think one of the reasons that I've always been my own boss since I was 23 is because of that kind of peak and trough of work. So I will work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day when I'm focused on something, but then I need a week off. And that it's one of the things I've tried to do in my business actually is manage by output rather than input, which is very difficult to do if you've got to keep a restaurant open. But what you can do is have kind of mindful approaches, or a bar open, is to have mindful approaches to shift patterns and kind of let people work out what their natural rhythms are. Are they kind of 3 or 4 day binge people followed by 2 or 3 day rest people? You know, what are their natural patterns? Because if you can build a neurodiverse team where you've got different people with different preferences and patterns, then you should be able to get coverage.
Okay, let's come to those toolkits then. Now, among us, we each have a different approach, I think, to managing our ADHD and our journeys with it. And Tom is exploring the route of medication. And I thought that you might take a moment to share with us your tips on diagnosis and also a toolkit of survival when you are taking that route. So let's come to your slide, if that's all right.
Absolutely. I'm aware we're on a timer, so I'm going to try and make it as succinct as possible. So essentially the first thing to do is just recognize, you know, that there is an issue and there is a problem. It's very tempting, especially for, you know, I come from a part of the world where, you know, there is no problem. You just need to harden up and sort of, you know, get through it and so on and so forth. So it took me a long time to actually recognize there was a problem that needed to be managed, and to also accept that, you know, it's not something I can fix myself and I need to speak to someone about. After recognition and sort of a diagnosis, the one option is via medication. So that can take, because everyone as well has a very different sort of a brain chemistry makeup. It's not just a case of here is your pill, here is your, you know, your magic fix. It took quite a long time to dial into what the correct sort of mix for me was. And especially working around alcohol can create, you know, some problems. I would go from, you know, being completely normal, and then I'd have like a glass of wine with dinner and be with my wife, and she'd suddenly see my eyes go different directions, and you know, I'd just, you know, be talking nonsense. She will constantly retell the story of a time that I came home and still adjusting to medicine. I think I'd had 2 beers or something, and I went up to the roof to cook some chicken on the barbecue, and I came back down. I was like, the chicken is cooked. And she was like, you've been gone for 2 minutes. I was like, no, I've been gone for 45 minutes. And the chicken was just like raw, and apparently I just could not understand what she was saying. So it took some time. It took like and then after that I realized obviously I needed to, you know, adjust lifestyle and how late I was going out and, you know, that sort of thing. So that was also slightly humbling as well, to realize perhaps I wasn't the, you know, master of the meat wagon that I walk around in every day. So it did take some adjustment time as well. And after obviously the medication phase is the routine and planning. It's you realize that, you know, for so long before diagnosis and then working through it, I was like struggling, you know, why can't I just sit in the office and work on my laptop all day? Why can't I just start this document? Why can't I just do this thing? Which is, you know, very important for my job and our clients, and, you know, to make sure that we're delivering top quality work. So now it's about routine. It's about making sure that I'm up at a certain time. I've had my correct food. I've had the medication at the right time. I've set aside so instead of having like multiple meetings throughout the week, what I try and do is, you know, Monday, Tuesday will be my face days. So I'll go in, I'll have face-to-face meetings, I'll meet people, shake hands, do trainings, and then try and have 1 or 2 days where I'm actually sat at home, you know, trying to write and do the creative sort of development side of things, just because in an open plan office, I've found, and we share an office with some great people. Like I love everyone we work with, but it's just constant in and out, and people having meetings and loud conversations, and it just doesn't work for the brain, unfortunately. So I need to, you know, recognize the strengths and recognize the weaknesses, and plan for both of those. You know, try and make sure that I've set the face days, I've set the time at home days, and I have that routine, and it really is, that routine is valuable because you're planning out when you can and can't do things.
So true as well. That audio thing or having two things in the background can really be upsetting. It's good to get quiet time. I just want to touch, before we come off this slide, on your pathway with medication, because my experience of medication is that you can't drink with it. And your experience of medication was that you also couldn't drink with it. And yet we're in this industry where to eschew having a social beverage is almost not normal, not okay. There can be pressure on people to take part in drinking. And you ultimately found a way around that, didn't you?
Yeah, look, it was, I probably don't spend as many nights out or late nights out as I used to. I try and get my drinking done by like 8, 9 o'clock and then head home. There's still late nights as always. But look, once I found that correct sort of medication balance, I knew how my body would react to alcohol. I knew how I could sort of adjust my drinking intake. I knew my limits essentially. But when it was, switching between, as I say, dialing in the frequency of that medication for the first 2 months or so, one night I could go out and smash Ray and Nephew and do shots of Fernet until 4 a.m. and or I could have, a daiquiri and the back of my head would fall off. And so it was definitely for that starting period until you dial it in what the right level is for you. I would recommend just being very careful, just like trying to find that balance. And realistically, like at least in Hong Kong, and I think a lot of other markets as well, most people now aren't really, giving you shit if you don't have a shot or like, oh, whatever. Like you can go in and just have a soda water. And oftentimes I feel that what do you call it? That trepidation on your part is just you worrying about what other people think. But most times when you just say, can I have a soda water? Like bartenders are like, yeah, cool, it's fine. Or, have a shot and it's like, no, I'm good.
Since medicating, my relationship to non-alc spirits and beverages like that has completely changed. Whereas I didn't used to see much of a point in them. Now that I can't really drink, I'm just so glad that they exist and they play a very different role, I think. So yeah, very interesting. Okay, let's move on. Chanel's got a completely different approach, and I wanted to talk to you about how you regulate your ADHD with work. So yeah, take it away.
So in my intro earlier, I didn't actually mention when I found out I had ADHD. So when I was in high school, a good friend of mine saw me struggling constantly in terms of focusing, and he was diagnosed with ADHD, and he gave me Adderall to try. And for the first time in my life, I could completely focus. I could prioritize things properly. I could sit in class without moving. I got my homework done. I was able to be on time. like my entire life changed. And at the time, my mom really didn't believe in medicine. My mom grew up in Germany. ADHD is not really a thing. And moving into America so much over medicates that she thought that I would fall into that. By the time I was going to college, I told her it wasn't about her opinion at that point. I needed to be medicated if I was going to actually be successful in school. In high school, I could manage it. Of course, I had so much support, I had so much help, but going into college, that was not really an option anymore. So I got tested. It was very easy in America, honestly, to get tested. And I started being medicated. The downside of this for me, I guess genetically, biologically, I'm not really sure, my tolerance for Adderall goes up very quickly. So through college, I took my dosage essentially went ×5, and it was very much above the legal limit. And I got to a point where because I was taking so many amphetamines, my body was naturally just becoming super, super anxious. So I reached a point that by the time I graduated, I just wanted to stop, essentially. I through being a project coordinator, I was still taking medicine, and I realized that I couldn't live my entire life. If I couldn't do my job without medicine, then what was I really doing, right? And given my tolerance going up for this drug over the years, I couldn't imagine where I would be at 30. So I decided to stop. Luckily, I was able to stop working. I was able to take 4 months off to essentially detox. My parents were super supportive. I finally started to figure out what that would really mean for me. I thought it would be, I don't know why I thought as I was older, it would be easier to be able to deal with this. It wasn't. Luckily, I started bartending. Bartending was actually quite easy for me. Once I got past figuring out how to study for bars, it became quite simple. But over the years, I've had to figure out how to create balance in my life. And honestly, it's something that's completely ongoing. But fundamentally, I realized that the most foundational things for me personally were to regulate my food, making sure I ate at least twice a day, proper meals, making sure that I was sleeping. I require at least 8 hours a night to actually be a productive human. And finally, focusing on nutrition, whether falling asleep was quite difficult for me. So taking whatever supplements would essentially help me do that, and whatever vitamins I was missing just genetically in my body. This also led into learning how to schedule. So for me, I find scheduling to be the crux of essentially how I handle having ADHD. I schedule, everything is color coded, and based on just like looking at my week, I can tell if I'm going to burn out or not. The first thing I schedule actually into my week is exercise, because I know the bare minimum amount of exercise I can do for a week and still sleep. Next is professional responsibilities. I learned that I am terrible at to-do lists. I don't like to-do lists. They stress me out by nature. So I just started scheduling immediately everything that I had to do professionally. This is going to be different for everyone, obviously. Going back to exercise though, I think the most important part isn't what you do. It's just doing something that you can do consistently. For me personally, I had to find something I genuinely enjoyed, and I had to find a community that held me accountable to do it regularly outside of my own basic need. Finally, I actually have to schedule my social life. I make a point to try to see my friends. I'm not very good at it. That's honestly where I tend to fall. That's honestly where I tend to fail the most. But not having time with people that you care about makes it quite hard for you to focus in your normal life. I actually schedule self-care. If I don't schedule it, I won't do it. But spending time to take a bath or do it, like, I don't know, you need to essentially have time to yourself and to focus on yourself. And then finally, for me to avoid burnout, I really need to do a lot of blackout dates. I literally write no on my calendar, and I just don't allow myself to schedule anything when I know that a week is going to be particularly overwhelming. I still fail quite often at this, but I'm getting better at recognizing when that's going to happen for myself. The goal of all of this for me is to create a balance in my life. I've spent the past 8 years trying to figure out what balance means to me, and it's constantly changing. COVID helped that quite a lot. I had a lot more time to focus on myself, but it's still something that I'm changing daily. The most important part for me to be able to keep to this type of scheduling was essentially setting intentions for myself in terms of what I wanted to focus on and accomplish on a weekly basis, I would say, starting quite small. And then for me, having a greater sense of purpose in terms of what I want to accomplish in my career has helped me be able to keep to this type of scheduling, because otherwise, what's the point on days that you don't want to do something? And the biggest thing for me is not being medicated, you fail quite often. In my experience, at least significantly more than I failed when I was medicated. But I just have learned to forgive myself. I think something about being older, failing so many times, liking myself, I allow myself room for failure, and I try to position myself professionally in a space that will allow me to fail at times as well.
Wonderful. I love that. Well, we're about to close the seminar, but before we do, let's just quickly do a run through. We have collectively agreed some ways that we believe that businesses could better support neurodivergent team members. And I'm going to hand over to Dr. Nancy. I feel like your initial point is probably the most important, Dr. Nancy, because it's not how can you, but you have to.
You do. It's the law. So, most developed economies are signed up to the United Nations Rights Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In most of those countries, ADHD qualifies as a disability, and it's the law that organisations must make reasonable accommodations for individuals who are disabled, and also that business must take into account the idea of universal design, so design with disabilities in mind. And when we think of that in terms of wheelchair users, we think about step-free access and wide doors. And when we think about it, how do we think about that with regards to ADHD? That is a harder question. You know, what's the equivalent of step-free access for the ADHDer, and how do we design that into what we're doing? So shift patterns.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, but you have to. That's the point. Yeah. You have to. So if you're not, it's not that you're losing out and you're not being cool and groovy. It's that you're breaking the law. So I think it's worth just remembering that. So, you know, my top tips really for this sort of thing are to really look at shift patterns, and I alluded to that earlier, to look at the management style and communication, and consider co-coaching and coaching. So that lovely bit of self-development that Chanel described is the kind of things that come out of the coaching process. So when we do individual coaching programs, usually what we're doing is helping people work that stuff out. What works for you as an individual? How do you work at your best? What's your most productive time of day? Can you put all the things that are hardest for you to do into that time of day? How do you schedule? What do you use? Do you need color codes? Do you need reminders? Do you need something that works as an app on your phone that also connects to your laptop? So syncing all that stuff up is very often what people do in coaching. And in co-coaching, what we look at is the relationship between the employer and the employee, and what kind of management style and communication is going to work for that person in that context. And it is all about what is reasonable. You know, people aren't expected to, people have to do a job, and, you know, you still have to do your work, but how can we support you to work at your best is the question that we're asking. And that's what a responsible employer is doing. And, you know, the kind of things you might look at as well as an employer are the IT solutions. So what till systems you're using, whether or not those are particularly draining on working memory, if there's something that you could be using that's more user-friendly, that has better UX design in it. IT transitions are a nightmare for neurodivergent thinkers. All of the neurodivergent thinkers, all of those minorities find IT transitions a pain. So, you know, prep for that. Have the neurodivergent staff be involved in the planning of the IT transition. Have them be the key liaison point that works with the IT company to decide and select what system you go with and how it gets implemented. You can embrace that as an employer. It doesn't have to be a burden. It can actually be a real value add to have somebody who likes doing novel things, helping you with the key transitions. And really look at the way you're managing your organizational tools as a company as well, the way that you're designing your rotas in terms of your shift pattern, but also the technology that you're using to have access to them. You know, are they written on a piece of ratty paper stuck on the back of the door of the staff room, or are they on some sort of electronic calendar that people can check in on when they're not at work? That sort of thing is really helpful. And, you know, this is what Genius Within does. So, you know, help is out there for businesses. And if you're going to bring in some help, obviously, I think Genius Within is amazing. But what I would say to you is whatever advice you get from experts in the field, there are two ways to be an expert in this field. Number one, you have to understand HR law and management science. And number two, you have to understand neurodiversity. Genius Within is 50% neurodivergent staff. We walk our own talk. We don't think it's okay for us to be giving advice on how to be inclusive of neurodivergence if we can't do neurodivergence ourselves. 60% of our management team and board are neurodiverse. 43% of our staff team as a whole, and 60% of our staff team as a whole identify as disabled. So, you know, you really be careful and try before you buy in this field is what I would say as well.
I just wanted to chime in and say that thing about the rotas is invaluable insight there. The number of times that I've forgotten my shift patterns and showed up to the wrong shift, or worse, not showed up to the right shift. A couple more that you've got. Think flexibly, conflict at work resolution, and this one came up earlier, impactful training for better information digestion.
Yes. All good.
Wonderful. Well, thus concludes really our seminar. And just as a quick takeaway, we came up with 3 resources. We'll be sending out fact packs and toolkits to help those with ADHD manage it in the workplace, and also for employers and managers. But if you're not going to read that through, that's okay. We came up with 3. We want you to immediately go and follow Genius Within. That's Dr. Nancy Doyle's company. I love your Instagram. It's full of really interesting.
My sister runs that. My sister that used to work in hospitality and now looks after her autistic niece, who can't obviously work in hospitality anymore. She does my Insta. She's very cool. It's
very good content and really insightful, and often quite emotive as well. I really like it. So that's the first thing that you should do immediately. There are a whole host of online spots, places on Facebook that you can go and join in and find a community of people that are talking about their trials and tribulations and how they overcome them. And if you are interested in maybe getting a better handle on your alcohol intake, then I think it would be remiss of us not to mention how you could do so. And Club Soda, I have found in my journey with medication a really great place to go and read about other people's journey avoiding alcohol. They're really supportive and all about finding that authentic self within, without the use of boozing. So before we leave, I just want to say thank you so much to Tom. Great to have you on the panel. Thank you so much, Chanel. And thank you so much, Dr. Nancy. Your insight and wisdom has been incredible. So thanks all so much for coming. And yeah, there will be fat packs coming your way for anyone that would like them. Goodbye. Thanks from me.
Goodbye. Thanks for watching and listening, spending your time with us.
Bye.